Welcome, everybody. My name is Elizabeth Hamblet. I am the author of Seven Steps to College Success, a pathway for students with disabilities. And I am delighted to be back here for what we think may be our fifth annual webinar with my friend Jane Sarouhan, Sarouhan, from J2 Guides. She's one of the founders, along with her husband Jason, who is off working on 10th grade math tonight. So I'd much rather be here myself. Uh, and also, this time, as a special guest, we are joined by Caitlin Garman of Broad Futures. My field is preparing students with disabilities for a successful college transition. And very often, I get asked about how do I assess students' readiness and what are parents going to do if they think that the next step right after high school is probably not going to be college. And what should they do? And so I have been interviewing Jane and Jason for my books because I like to make sure there's some options in there for everybody. Gosh, since the first one came out in 2011. And so with that, I'm going to turn us over to Jane so she can get us started talking all about gap year experiences for students with LD and ADHD.
Great. Thank you, Elizabeth. And for those who are logged in early watching us, we were hoping to do a Facebook live stream and we just didn't get the tech figured out. So you got to see the end of that. And what our plan is for this evening is, to the start, Caitlin and I are going to really do the bulk, I think, of the presenting. I'm going to go macro level with how to think about a gap year. And then Caitlin gets to really take it in detailed with what it actually looks like in play with a program specifically for students with learning disabilities. And Elizabeth will all the while be masterfully, as always, managing questions, either interrupting us or taking notes, or we're going to leave a nice amount of time at the end for a dialogue around us. But I'm just going to do a quick intro slide, and then I think Caitlin has one, and then I'll go back into my deck. But just briefly, as Elizabeth said, I'm Jane Sarouhan. My husband Jason and I are the J2 of J2 Guides. I've been working in experiential education for 30 years now, since leading my first trips, taking my own gap year, running an international organization. Took about 400 students overseas annually, and now gap year consulting for the last 15 years. So, I've really, and I have a parent, I'm a parent of a neurodivergent teenager myself. And so, I've really held all the roles, sat in all the seats, worn all the hats, and continue to be just really overwhelmed by how the right gap year can support every student. And it's not a cookie cutter thing here, but and that's what's kept me in the work for so long, is seeing time and time again the incredible reward that a young adult on the precipice of change may be feeling like the system isn't quite working for them, or maybe just needs a breather. Either way, all the ways they are coming out the other side as sort of more fully actualized young adults, the exact thing that we are hoping as parents and professionals to see. So I'll share more of that, but that's sort of my very quick, in a nutshell, story of how I have been occupying various seats in this field for the last 3 decades.
Hi, everyone. My name is Caitlin Garman. I'm the Director of Admissions and Outreach at Broad Futures. I've spent the better part of the last 15 years working with adolescents and college-age students with disabilities, a lot of that involving post-secondary planning, and now work on program side. So I'm at Broad Futures, and we are an internship program specifically for neurodivergent students. And we are an accredited Gap Year Association program, which means we serve many, many gap year students every year. And with that, I'll turn it back to Jane, and I'll see you all in a couple slides.
Every presentation I make, regardless of the audience, is always a definition of a gap year, because I think we all come into it with real assumptions. And that's often where the conversation ends for some people. We have seen it in the news, or we've seen a neighbor or a relative, and we think a gap year means it's got to be service. It's got to be international. That's a big one that might come up in this conversation. It's going to cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. It's going to be the same thing for the entire year. A lot of assumptions coming in, and this is the definition that a group of us have refined in a strategic planning session with the Gap Year Association, which is the accrediting and the federally recognized standard setting body for all things gap year in the US. And I have an accreditation, as does Broad Futures and Caitlin, which is amazing. And this is the working definition that the GYA has now produced, which is a gap year is simply an intentional period of time devoted to personal growth and exploration through experiential learning opportunities. Isn't that just such a like delightful sigh of relief? There's no big pressure here. There's no big pressure of it being international, which I know is a concern when we sometimes are thinking about students with learning differences or disabilities and their success with travel, with time management, train schedules, all kinds of things. Again, it's really about removing oneself from the traditional four walls of a classroom. Nowhere in here, it's all about learning by doing, which all kinds of learners are really tend to thrive and do best when it's really applied learning. I get to take this stuff from a textbook, from a lecture. Maybe that's not my best learning avenue anyway, but when you put me in with people, when you put me in the place, when you put the thing in my hand, I'm much more likely to get really engaged with it. And so, this being a broad definition that we are now carrying forth into the gap year space, and I would imagine sets a really appropriate tone for our particular conversation as well. And furthermore, I like to talk about it's sort of another kind of piece of that last slide, but notice again in that last slide in the definition, there's no specific how old you are, how many semesters of college maybe you've done or not done, where you plan to go, what you plan to do. These are the kinds of things that we see as fundamental, regardless of those details. So a gap year is dot, 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 whether it's a young adult in an internship in DC or a young adult learning how to surf in Australia. This is the breadth of skills that we see coming out the other side, no matter what. And again, thinking about setting our young adults up for success post high school, be it college, be it gap year, be it trade school, be it home working, these would be the things I would want to see as paramount in planning that period of time. Is this going to be a space where our young adults are gaining more soft and hard skills? The soft skills of communication, maybe managing conflict with roommates, maybe just personal advocacy in the classroom. Am I going to have the confidence to go up to a teacher or a TA after class to ask for help? So a gap year, or again, any intentional period of time, is really hopefully another year of a young adult developing more of those soft skills, regardless of environment. And the hard skills is anything from taking those 2 or 3 years of classroom Spanish into an immersive environment where maybe it becomes a bit more conversant. Again, that's that hands-on real world application. I'm touching it, I'm hearing it, I'm using it, as opposed to just reading 100 pages in a textbook at night. A student will inevitably come away with, I think, some robust and renewed hard skills as well. Other factors to be thinking of, regardless of one's destination or desire, being with peers, having mentors. And again, having hands-on learning content that's really drawing me in. And all of this comes in the form of a variety of different kinds of programmings. But one thing you may notice here is a lot of infrastructure. You're seeing groups of people together. You're seeing them working on something, summiting a peak, maybe volunteering on a farm, in a music studio with a homestay family in Costa Rica. But everyone is there with an intention as well. That is an extension of part of what kind of drives them. Um, I want to just keep moving quickly because I want to make sure we have so much time. So I know I'm throwing a lot out there. The next sort of thing I like to talk about for families is there's no wrong reason to take a gap year, but of course we want to be able to identify the reason. Knowing your why is really powerful and important step for a student to also be able to have even a two-sentence answer in response to everybody they're going to see at Thanksgiving next week. Why are you thinking of a gap year? Well, I feel like I could dot, 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 grab 2 or 3 of these phrases that really resonate with you or your student, your child. They're all really relevant and universal reasons. And my guess
Jane,
is, yeah.
I was gonna say, I love that. And also, I would like to remind us all not to do that to teenagers at Thanksgiving.
Right? I'm so glad you said it, but I'm preparing them that it's going to happen.
Yes, I
Like,
love
no
this. No,
one
no, no.
here
And
would
by
do
the way,
that. No
um,
one here in this phone call.
yeah, and another option for them is not sure,
Not sure.
not sure.
But one thing, and I'm so glad you said that, Elizabeth, and one reason why I equip students with some of these phrases,
No, I
knowing
think
that
that's
they're going to
great.
relate to them, is they could come up with their elevator pitch. I'm not sure I'm going to go on to college. I might take a gap year because I'd love to develop my independent living skills, and gain some more maturity and confidence in a gap year. So,
Mhm.
where you can quickly be sort of befuddled by those well-intentioned questions a teenager could. You're exactly right, Elizabeth. If someone could come up with a few phrases and have it in their back pocket, it can really sort of soften the defensiveness or that kind of on the heels reaction of, well, what are you doing next year?
I think that's really smart. Yeah.
Yeah. It also becomes a compass point. Well, we know we're looking at a gap year because we want to address the academic burnout, or we know that one of our goals is to address mental health. And I can tell you, and I can only see Elizabeth and Caitlin, no one else, but we're all nodding, right? Like these are the reasons students are thinking of taking gap time, and it's not going to scare a professional or provider. In fact, a student knowing oneself and being able to say, these are some of the reasons why I think I want to take gap time will easily impress any gap year program. They wouldn't expect to hear really otherwise. So, how can a gap year benefit an LD student is specifically how I renamed this label. So, these can be both the hopes and also the results. That's what it tends to be. My hope is
I
to
like
address
that.
academic burnout. Guess what? That is a really realistic byproduct. My hope is to develop some independent living skills. Yeah, with the right program, that's absolutely going to happen. So this is an interesting slide in that it is really both the beginning and the end of the journey in a way, for a gapper. Um, Lots of concerns and questions come up about how one should advise their student or young adult when thinking about a gap there, and lots of concerns around losing academic momentum, right? That's a big one. How can a gap program really support my LD child? How do I choose a program? What programs are the right fit? Not all of them, like Broad Futures, are specifically for neurodivergent young adults. So, could my LD kiddo be successful in a typical gap year program? And what are some of the things I can be pursuing? So, I'm going to just jump around, knowing that we are all different kinds of learners. And if you're really interested in reading down the columns, I'm going to just talk through some of them, mostly in order from left to right. Um, but addressing the academic kind of momentum, will my young adult lose study habits? And as a parent of a kid who's been on an IEP since kindergarten, who's now a sophomore in high school, I have a lot I can relate to around that. Fears and worries. Regression is that word that got branded in our brains early on, right? We don't want to see regression. Um, and COVID, right? We were really worried about our kiddos who were, uniquely oriented around their learning. Um, so I think it's a reasonable concern or question to have. And yet, what we have seen time and time again is that when students design a gap year that's the right gap year for them with the right support, and we address that mental health, academic burnout, all of those issues, increased maturity, we're actually seeing that immediately translate into the work and or college environment. And so we are seeing students, whatever little hiccups or delays. I mean, I've had the best of students also come back to me and say, wow, those first few months back at school after a year of not reading 100 pages a night, that took a little bit. So we don't want to paint a perfect picture here, but the thing that quickly comes, the secondary comment is, but I felt so much more confident. Sure, it was a little rusty, but I got there, right? Because there's all these other things that are in place. That student is sitting up and paying attention. They probably have figured out their time management. They're getting to class, they're figuring out meals, they're advocating for themselves. So it's the confidence and the real world relevancy that's happening on the gap year that's not going anywhere. It's traveling with our kids when they hit that next step post gap year. So there could be, and I bet Elizabeth could really speak to how we can best prep our students and make that bridge between end of a gap year and starting college. But there's just really no evidence to state that it's going to be in any way a deterrent to a young adult's life and learning.
Right. And maybe you're going to get to this later, Jane, but in fact, there are some colleges that really encourage a gap year because they know what the results can be for a lot of students. And this is not just students with learning disabilities and ADHD. So that I
Right.
think speaks to the power of this experience.
Yes, so much. Um, is moving more specifically about how GAP programs could support your student with a learning disability, ADHD. I think there's a few things I want to point out. I can't speak to all GAP year programs, but keeping in mind, generally speaking, we're looking at a student to leader or instructor ratio of like 6 to 1, something just, you just wouldn't find in a college environment. So we're talking about really small, intimate groups with instructors who are there in many cases 24/7, really traveling literally and metaphorically with the group on this journey. And I would say most gap year programs would say that their primary goal is the emotional growth and well-being of these young adults. Yes, we want them to get versed in their internship. Yes, we'd love them to get further along in their language acquisition or whatever it may be. But I think we all really hold ourselves as people who are really invested in that emotional, the EQ, really supporting students on that growth. Many gap year programs are very all inclusive. So we are talking about highly structured programs that have housing and meals and activities included. Not all of them, but many. So this isn't just we're going to drop your young adult in a city by themselves. Good luck to you. Um, Other things to think about as you start investigating on your own, and this is where starting to follow programs on Instagram or jumping into webinars to really start to see if it's right for you or your student. Um, a few words that we use here at J2 Guys that I think might be helpful. You might be thinking about residential versus expeditionary type of programs. Expeditionary does not mean climbing Everest. Expeditionary for me means traveling. And so oftentimes I find that a student who's maybe a nervous traveler or maybe a student with a learning disability where a lot of constant change is what they need is routine, we might be wanting to focus on a residential experience, a program where they have a home base for 1 or 2 or 3 months. And there's going to be enough newness and enough challenge that that's going to be the stimulation, but maybe they're best in one place. Now, there are other students who are like, actually, I have a lot of energy. I don't want to sit still. The more, the better. I want to move every 3 or 4 days. Then an expeditionary program model might be better for them. So you have kind of that. That's one thing to think about. Of course, domestic versus international is a big consideration for a lot of families. And again, just amazing tonight that you're going to hear example of that again, residential and domestic, soft and hard skills. Um, but a domestic program can be again enough of a start, enough of a launch from home. It doesn't have to be international. Bringing it back to that definition, nowhere does our definition of a gap year say it's got to be international. Huge growth and learning happens outside of school and most often outside of home. That is, I think, a pretty key portion. If this was a gap year versus college and you were already looking to send a young adult away to college, then it's certainly reasonable to think about sending them away to a gap semester or year. But I think some of the best learning our kids need to do, particularly if we have been supporting and offering a lot of advocacy and scaffolding for the last 15 years, we have to start pulling back and trusting the other professionals in our field. So domestic versus international, and maybe you'll have a little bit of both. If you feel like the international waters could be really exciting, but not quite out the gate, maybe you begin the gap year with a fall semester in the US, a residential fall semester in the US, and maybe even move to an international experience in the second half of the year. So that's another strategy. And then again, what's best for your child? Well, what's really important right now in the growth set? Is it soft skills? Are there particular hard skills or areas of interest? Um, the last thing I want to say here is sort of in terms of like how to take all of this. I think really all this information and data aside of what you're going to get plenty more of, I think one of the next most important steps is really just to like take out a huge piece of like, poster paper and play with your young adult, play with your student, and encourage them to write down everything that gets them happy. Because at the end of the day, we're all at this conversation because we're at a crossroads. I've already mentioned that. And we're working with young adults who want to feel good about who they are in the world, and they want to feel good as learners in the world. And the traditional classroom setting has probably been a lot of extra work for 4, if not 14 years. And so I believe some of the most important pieces of a gap year is just rediscovering a love of learning and rediscovering kind of a love of self, of students really coming out feeling great about themselves. And so to feed that, making sure in all these details and things we're trying to figure out and how to make sure it's successful, don't forget this brainstorm. Don't forget to put out that paper and colored pens and paper, and really encouraging your student, your young adult, to write down every single thing that makes them happy. Don't worry if you don't know how it's going to fit into a gap year box. It doesn't matter. I love the dogs. The dogs are my favorite thing in the world. We love our dogs. Great. Write it down. We're going to come back to that, right? I played Ultimate Frisbee. Love Ultimate Frisbee. Awesome. Put it down. This is a period of time where I think students need yeses. They need to feel excitement about it and not the perimeters or boundaries. Well, I don't know how we could afford that, or I'm not sure if that even exists in a gap year. We'll come to that later. But initially, if it's really about getting a student on board and starting to see what they think that gap year could look like, inevitably over time, they will absolutely generate one, if not 10 ideas that are realistic and attainable. And that's the spark that we want to see in them, that we can then offer all this other additional support and program guidance. You will, of course, come to your parameters and goals, parents. And the last thing I said here on this slide, which I'm really glad I almost skipped over, but transparency is so important when we talk about experiential learning, about taking students out of the home. Your young adult is going to get more attention on a gap year program than they will in college. But being transparent with a gap year program, these are our concerns, just in the same way you'd say, my child has like a life-threatening bee allergy. You would also want to say, my child's also managing anxiety and depression right now and is on this medication, as well as has a 504, and could use some support with some of their, executive functioning and planning. So transparency with programs so that we are all able to help support and scaffold the right plan and place for your student on program. And I think I'm just going to quickly go ahead. Okay, good. So this is just my last slide. So I'm going to go back and then hand it off to Caitlin. I've already mentioned once, this idea that maybe you would do an experience in the fall and then something else in the spring. And this is how I sort of look at the year. If your gapper is potentially considering a full year, of course, remember that definition didn't say how long it has to be. Maybe it's a semester, maybe it's a summer. Um, but if it's a full year, let's play with that, an academic year, it's very likely you would divide that year up into 1 or 2 or 3 parts. And if that were the case, then we would really encourage you to be thinking about a gap year progression where you are, of course, starting with the most support and structure. And that's the most structured program. There's going to be the more expensive programs. That's all the bells and whistles, the housing, the meals, the group, the mentors, the activities, the life skills. It's all there. And you can really feel good that your young adult is going to be very well supported. Um, if that goes well and you feel like your young adult has emerged having really embodied some of those skills, chances are you might be able to strip away a little bit of scaffolding and maybe take the next step into that center column, semi-structured experiences. Maybe there's housing and meals, but maybe there's a bit more independence. And notice the subtlety of the words that I used. I went from a group in the most structured to peers in semi-structured, mentors in most structured to maybe a coordinator in semi-structured. So you can see what I'm getting at. A little bit less of that kind of social emotional stewardship is starting to kind of pull away when we pull away some of the scaffolding. Still incredibly rich and meaningful and growthful opportunities, but a little bit maybe more self-directed. And that would lead us, of course, to the end of a year. if it felt right, if the student was ready. They've talked about a road trip around California, visiting other friends in college, or maybe getting a Eurorail pass and traveling around Europe. That might be a time that least structured experience generally fits best at the end of the year. And again, only if a student is ready for it. Maybe every segment of your gap year is most structured, most structured, most structured. It doesn't have to go this way. But it's really, we have found time and time again, quite enlightening when we share this kind of family data with families, that it really resonates to think about the year in parts, think about potential areas for growth. Again, most structured could also go domestic to international, or could go residential to expeditionary. It's about starting with um, the zone in which a student can find themselves and find success, right? We can grow in the stretch zone, but we will not in the stress zone. So we want to make sure that we are helping students at the right time and the right place. And only you, the parent or consultant, will know as you are moving through the journey with your student. So I will pause and mute myself there. And thanks to everyone for your patience. And Caitlin, it's off to you. Can you manage your own slides, or do you want me to do it? Do you have control?
I don't think I do, if you don't mind clicking
I
through.
love it. Here we
And
go.
for those of you watching us live here, drop your questions in the chat. And when Caitlin's all done, we will circle around and try to answer all of them. And Jane, thank you. I know that there are so many questions that people have too, and we'll get to them after Caitlin's done about like I think part of what you were saying about transparency, and I'll be interested to see what Caitlin says too, because I know when we have concerns about our students and their level of independence, sometimes it's because of how great we see their needs being. And, we'll talk about what kinds of things you need to make sure you tell them. So, with that, Caitlin.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Jane. That was a great overview of gap years and all the different parts of it. I'm going to talk just briefly about Broad Futures, which is one example of a less structured domestic gap year option, and talk a little bit about how incorporating a program like ours into a gap year can be a really great option, especially for students with learning and attention differences. So you can see a little bit here just about the structure of our program. We are an internship program in Washington, D.C., and we are specifically for neurodivergent young folks, which makes us very cool and unique in this space. But we often have folks taking a gap year directly after high school, or as Jane said, taking a gap semester or gap year when they've tried a little bit of college as well. So our programs combine internships with training and personalized mentoring. So the internship portion of our program really gives folks, our participants, the chance to do it, what Jane called learning by doing, right? It really gives folks a chance to explore what they're interested in outside of the classroom and really get grounded in thinking about their future in a very real way. So you can see we match folks into internships based on their interests and their skills. So, if a young person is super interested in social media and they think maybe that's going to be a career for me, well, cool. What better way to explore that? Not sitting in a classroom just hearing about it, but going and doing an internship where you get to create some content, see what it's like to sit on a marketing team meeting, see what it's like to create a content calendar and have to produce that kind of stuff. Along with that internship, we do really explicit training. And so a lot of our training touches on some of those skills that Jane talked about and that are sort of baked into a lot of gap year programs. And we just touch on them a little bit more explicitly. So our training it's interactive, it's fun. And to that same point, our training is meant to mimic a real world scenario. So it's a place for a student, a young person to really practice some of these skills that we're trying to help them develop in a really safe, supportive environment. So if you're a young person, a young person you're advising, they're really, really struggling with time management, right? So if they go off to college and, they're 15, 20, 30 minutes late to their 8 a.m. class every day, they're going to fail that class. They're not going to get that credit. You're going to be down that money. That's a really big real world consequence. Versus they're in a program like ours for a gap year, they're really struggling with time management. Okay, great. They've got a mentor who is there to meet with them to think about, all right, what are the strategies that we can put in place, right? To encourage them, to help them build that skill without having that sort of like real world consequence, so that they can take those strategies and that skill with them and then go into college and say, you know what? I feel good about this. I've practiced this strategy. I've successfully gotten myself to work on time. I can tackle an 8 a.m. class. So our training touches on a lot of different topics. We talk a lot about professionalism and communication, things like how to make a good first impression, right? Excellent for the workplace, also excellent if you're walking into a college classroom for the first time. How to advocate for yourself, right? We've touched a little bit on this, but leaping from high school into this sort of post-secondary world, you go, if you had, an IEP or a 504 plan in high school, you go from an environment where everyone knew what your accommodations were, they understood your strengths, they knew what you needed, and frankly, part of their job was to be checking in with you to, on a college campus where you have to find the Office of Disability Supports, you have to make the appointment, you have to keep the appointment, you have to be able to describe your own disability and say what accommodations you need. And then you got to be able to advocate if things aren't going well. And so that's a lot of skills that you need to practice. And so doing a program like ours is a place where we can talk explicitly about what all those skills are and then really practice in this real world setting. So you get confident and you feel good about going into a college classroom and saying, hey, this is who I am. This is what I need. And can you help me get this accommodation that I need? We also talk a lot about workplace readiness skills. And again, these are the types of things that are transferable to a workplace, an internship, or a college campus. So things like developing a personal pitch, being able to talk about yourself. And, Jane talked about that's helpful for Thanksgiving dinner. It's helpful when you're talking to a professor, an advisor, and it's certainly helpful when you are networking in the office. We also talk a lot about disclosure and accommodation. So to that other point, thinking about how do I get to understand myself in this setting? How do I understand what accommodations I need? And how do I get comfortable deciding if I'm going to disclose which disabilities I have, when that might be important, or how I can just talk about my strengths, my needs in a workplace. And then those executive functioning skills, these are baked into a lot of gap year programs. We just work on them pretty explicitly in ours, right? We talk about what are the executive functions? What does it mean to have time management and organization in a real world setting versus just in your high school class schedule? We work a lot on what are some different strategies, right? Because there are a ton of strategies. It's about finding ones that work for your individual young person. And so, spending 9 to 12 weeks with us, right? We can try out a lot of different stuff so that young person walks away from our program knowing the way, my organization structure, right? Having alarms doesn't work for me, but blocking out time on my calendar, oh, that did work for me. I used that successfully at my internship for a couple of weeks. And now I know that's the strategy I'm taking with me. That's what I'm going to lean on in the future. And then the other part of our program is the mentorship. And again, Jane, you touched on this a whole bunch. Really, really important part of any gap year program, and ours, again, super baked into everything we do. That mentor is really there to be a supportive person in that young person's life, and for our participants to practice, okay, how do I use this supportive person when I need it? How do I identify when I need their help? How do I ask them for the help, right? Because that mentor is going to jump in at the beginning of our program and say, hey, I've gotten some feedback from your boss. This isn't going well. Let's strategize. But then towards the end of the program, we'll see participants saying to their mentor, hey, I've got a really important meeting where my boss is going to let me present to the team. Can I role play that with you? Can I practice that with you first, right? And so our young people are learning how to lean on those supports that they'll have whatever they do in the future. If we want to go to the next one, just talk a little briefly about some of the goals of our program. And I think you'll be able to see how these really align with this slide that Jane showed. It was yellow. It talked about all the reasons why a student especially with learning or attention differences, might benefit from a gap year. You can see how sort of the goals of our program really line up with that. And our program goals are similar to a lot of other gap year program goals. So we really, really want our folks to leave our program having had exposure to the real world and having built up some skills that are going to help them be successful, whether they are heading to college for the first time, heading back to college, or heading off into a work experience. So, the first and frankly most important goal is that building that confidence and independence. So again, folks in a program like ours that's a little bit less structured, they really have to learn how to manage their time. They have to be independent. They have to get to and from work. They have to navigate conversations with a boss, tackle tasks at work. And so doing all of those things builds up that independence, but also really builds up that confidence. So especially for a student who really struggled in high school. And, when you have a learning or attention difference, high school can be tough, right? And you can come out of that that experience feeling not great about yourself, feeling like maybe you're the kid who it always took a little bit of extra time or you always needed a little bit of extra help. And sometimes you get into an internship experience, real work experience, and see that you have all of these strengths and all of these abilities that maybe weren't highlighted in high school. And it is such a wonderful thing to see a young person really discover all of the strengths that they have that just weren't highlighted in high school for them. That independence and confidence are huge. And then the second piece is just getting real world experience, that learning by doing. And so for us, it's explicitly workplace experience, right? You get to go do a paid internship experience. You get to explore some of your interests. You get to learn about life after high school and have a real vision of what life could look like after high school for you. So really, really nice for students who are feeling burnt out from the traditional classroom setting. We're still working on those skills. We're still getting ourselves set with all those soft skills for college, but we're doing it in a way that feels much more real to folks and allows it to be much more hands-on learning. And then finally, those building those transferable skills. And so again, every gap year program is going to be baked into it are going to be we're building some skills for you to be able to launch successfully into adulthood. But we're really talking in our program really specifically about things like advocacy and problem solving and communication, all of these skills that are so important for our young people, whether they're going to college after or a work setting or wherever they're heading after. And then I know I want to be mindful of time, but I just wanted to share, Jane and I had talked about sharing kind of an example. So of a student who had a learning attention difference, came and did a gap year and kind of what they got out of it. And so I left the name out of here, but this is sort of a case study of a student we worked with a few years ago. So sort of for all the reasons that we've laid out this evening so far, this was a student came to us and just really, really needed a gap year. She'd been accepted to college, but just was not ready. Her and family were both on board with the fact that she was not quite ready, was feeling just very burnt out of academics, could not envision, graduating high school and then immediately going and sitting in a college classroom, was really struggling with confidence, had a rough time graduating high school and was really seeing herself as someone who just wasn't very smart and wasn't quite sure what that future was going to look like for her. And then those executive functioning skills were something she admittedly from her own interview, right, said, I really struggle. I struggle with time management. I struggle with keeping myself organized. I struggle with having, she didn't use the word stamina, but having the stamina to get through an entire day of class, an entire week of class. And so she and her family worked with a wonderful gap year counselor, and decided to do a full gap year. And in the fall, did some service work abroad, which was wonderful, and then came to us in the spring during her spring semester of her gap year to really build up some of those skills and really prep for college in the fall. So she happened to be a student who really loved animals and had done some volunteer work at the zoo before. So we were able to place her into an internship at an animal lab at George Washington University, which was just a really cool internship. So really got in some of her interests and really connected to things she was already kind of thinking about for her future. But she just flourished in our program. So, her confidence grew tenfold. She was, able to independently take on all these tasks at work. She was grooming the animals and getting them ready for the testing. She was doing things that actually were academic projects. She did this big data entry project. She had to write up a bunch of reports, things that I think she would have balked at in high school. But all of a sudden, in this real world environment where there was a real connection to the work, she was, entering data from animals that she quite literally saw down the hall, and she felt very connected to the work and supported. These were things that she felt comfortable tackling. All of those self-management skills, she really got a chance to work on those. She worked closely with her mentor to figure out, okay, how should I build out my schedule? How do I prep myself so that I am on time every day? How do I figure out how to prioritize what I'm doing, right? And she got to practice all of those things at work over the course of 11 weeks. So she developed some really good habits and strategies for herself. She also got to practice advocating for herself, right? She was at her job by herself. And so when she ran into a problem, she had to think, okay, who should I ask for help? Is this a call to my mentor? Should I email my boss right now? Right. And she got to work through those things in real time. And then ultimately it really just helped solidify her purpose for going to school. And so all of a sudden college did not feel like, oh my gosh, I have to get through 4 more years of sitting in a classroom. It felt like, oh, wow, I've had this experience that I really liked and I felt successful in. And okay, if I want to do this kind of job in the future, I do have to go to college. But now I feel like I've built the skills and I've got this connection that I can lean on when college gets tough. And so, I share that as just one example of, how a gap year can really support some of those skills and development that especially students with learning and attention differences really benefit from. And so, at the end of her story, she did go on to college in the fall after having just a phenomenal experience with us. She has been studying zoology, which is so cool. And she's set to graduate this year. So she's had a really successful time in college, and no doubt thanks to all of her gap year experiences and really taking that intentional time to develop some of the skills to get that real world experience and really build that confidence to where college felt very manageable to her.
That's amazing. And what I kept hearing you say, Caitlin, was confidence, confidence, confidence. And so being the person talking about transition to college, in this group, that is so important to me. And I talk about that all the time. And the phrase I'm hoping to get on a t-shirt one day is competence builds confidence.
Mm.
And so, especially for students who, as Jane was, alluding to earlier, are getting so much support from adults all the way through high school just to survive or even to support them in, achieving more than maybe they imagine for themselves. The thing that I worry about is what they worry about is do they worry that they were only able to achieve these things because of the support of adults and that confidence, we have this psychological concept and I'm really, I know this much about it of self-efficacy, which is that if you believe that you can do something, pardon me, then you will probably, put your effort into doing it. And so when students lack self-efficacy, I think college can be overwhelming because, as you both pointed to, the need for self-management. I mean, holy cow, Caitlin, right? Like the getting to the 8 a.m. classes, you don't always have a choice. Or it's a nighttime class and you have been goofing around all afternoon and your friends are want to go do something and now it's time to get to class. So all of these skills that we're talking about are so important to all of this. And one of the things that smarter people than I always talk about is there are a lot of schools who are very students, pardon me, who are very academically capable,
Yep.
but they do not, that's all that they have is the academic skills,
Mm.
and they just lack the self-management and the all of those skills. Sorry, it's the end of the day for me. That's the only word I can come up with. So, since we've got folks on Zoom, I don't see any questions in the chat yet, but go ahead and drop them if you like, or put them in the Q&A, either way. Jane, I know that sometimes when you and Jason do this webinar with me, we talk about you did mention, my students on a med for anxiety or depression? And are there things that families should be thinking about, like for themselves, about whether their student is currently ready for the kind of experiences you're talking about? I know sometimes countries don't allow them in with their meds, continuity of care with therapists. So if you want to touch on that while we see if any questions come in.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think that and I'd love, Caitlin, of course, to chime in. There are some challenging countries with a few meds, but it overwhelmingly has not been prohibitive for students. But it all is part of the story. So, I think the things we talk about, a lot of students are potentially also working with a therapist. So I think bringing the therapist into the loop. I'll be speaking this week with the family's therapist. I am not a mental health professional, so certainly as I'm sending programs to the family and they're sending them in front of the therapist, but the therapist doesn't know how to look at them, I'm like, well, just tell her to call me, So I think bringing the team in, because all of us have an angle on that student. All of us have a sense, a unique one that's overlapping, but also of what could benefit. And I think along with that, again, is kind of being mindful of that teeter-totter of the stretch versus stress zone. So one of the things that any student with a learning disability knows, and we as their parents or educators know, no one can learn when they're dysregulated. So that's off the table. And these experiences can be a little dysregulating. So we actually do want to keep some level of continuity. That means generally don't experiment with changing meds. If the meds have been working for a good few years, this isn't like, I don't need the ADHD meds anymore. I'm not in class. I really want to break. Totally understand that curiosity of, well, who am I without this assistance?
Mhm.
But we wouldn't have a diabetic stop taking insulin on a gap year. So really making sure that's the transparency. That's if you think you might be ready to take a step with medication, then of course bringing in the prescriber, making sure everyone knows, and maybe trying, 6 months before your gap year begins and not the day before. So I think very common sense, practices. Plenty of students are going to be having telehealth appointments on their gap semesters. So again, if that's an important part of the overall care and support of what's working, then we want to make sure we are looking at programs that don't have a 15-hour time difference or that have a zero phone policy. That's not going to work. So we don't want to square peg round hole this at all. We want to kind of find the beautiful shape that your student is and find the program that can really welcome that beautiful shape in all of its totality. So, I mean, those are some of my initial thoughts, Elizabeth. I'd love to hear what Caitlin thinks too.
Yeah, I just, and you highlighted in a slide before, I think that idea of being transparent with programs is just so important, right? I love and do this all the time, talk to students and caregivers and families before they've applied to our program, right? Because we want to make sure it's a good fit before you go through all that hassle. And if it's not, that's okay. One of the great things about, the gap year community is it is such a wonderful community. And I've got, 15 other programs that I can share with you or say, oh, here's why I don't know that this is the right fit right now. Maybe think about us a year from now. Maybe think about us after you've done one or two of those other gap year options and you've gotten a little bit more skilled in XYZ area. But I think just being very transparent because everyone, the gap year program, the family, other supportive adults in this young person's life, everyone is invested in having this young person be successful, and throwing them into a mismatched program is not going to lead ultimately to their success. So I think that transparency piece is so important, and just figuring out, is this the right type of program? Is this, oh, maybe this one's a little bit not structured enough. Maybe we do need to shift into the more structured area, or maybe, oh yeah, maybe they're not ready to go international. Maybe we do need to shift domestic. So just being upfront about all those things so that you can get a real sense from the program. Is this going to be a right fit for my young person at this point in time?
Right. Because we all really want to we all want to set our students up for success. And so um to be veiled in any part of the process doesn't set our students up for success if and when then challenges arise. And so if a program feels like they are not the best match for you right away, well, I know that can feel not so great.
Mm.
It's definitely coming from a good place. It's definitely coming from a
Yeah.
place of, I don't think we have the support to offer you just yet. And I love the way you said that, Caitlin. Not now. We may not be the right program right now, but maybe in a semester or a year. And you want that. You don't want it, but you want it because programs take the responsibility of students incredibly seriously on these kinds
Right.
of experiences.
And what's interesting about that, and it is getting close to my bedtime, so I'm going to see if I can piece this thought together because um, people assume college acceptance means the college knows that your student is ready. That's not what college acceptance means. So colleges will take your student if they meet the requirements, but it's a very different kind of calculation or assessment than what you two are talking about, which is, whether this is the right time for that student, whether they're ready for this specific experience. And so that's actually something much more, you know, specific and useful, I think. Um, Jane, and I don't know, Caitlin, too, if you guys get this question, but one of the questions that I know often comes up in these webinars is, well, okay, so we're doing this in November, and my kid's working on their applications right now, but I'm not sure. So should she finish her applications? Like, what do we do? What if she gets into colleges and we get to April and we think, nah, college in the fall is not the right choice. So what do you recommend? Do students do their applications and then figure it out?
Mm. I mean, I if a student has some energy and momentum, there's a lot of reason to get a few college applications in as a senior in high school. This the culture of it, not that that's a reason to do something, but there is
It's
energy and
hard.
there's
Yeah.
momentum, and that's supportive. So, but what I would say to the family who really, if a student is just like really fizzling out, really is clear they don't want to go to college, at least right away. If they could get some energy to do one or two, that's what I say. Don't do 12, but why not apply to one? Understand what that process is because at some point you will be applying, most likely, very likely, to college, really in earnest for the first time or again. And yet there will not be, you won't be swimming in the stream with hundreds of other fish as a senior, and you'll be doing more of it on your own. So just to even go through the practice of it, I think there's real value to it. But I've also, that being said, I've also had students apply very successfully, and particularly a student with a learning disability. It may be just what they can do is to just, you know, push their sleeves up and knock out a really strong senior year and not apply to college. And those students can very successfully, all students I've seen apply very successfully during their gap year, receive a college admission, et cetera, et cetera. So again, it's really right fit is really, I think, one of our mantras in the gap year space is um, it's we're really trying to help every young student find their place in a way that I think, education is just trying to kind of funnel everyone in a more traditional way. So you know you best. That's one of my beliefs. Every student knows themselves best. The family knows themselves and the student best. So, you know, yeah, so it could really go either way based on what a student is up for and capable of. That's my first thought. I don't know, Caitlin, if you would add to that.
Yeah, we don't often get that question, but I can say from experience, we've had folks, in our program, similar to the example that I gave, who, have some acceptances sitting there, and that can be a nice piece of sort of connecting the experience that they're having with us to the future, saying, okay, why are we working on this time management stuff? Okay, well, let's think about in the fall. Let's think about
Mhm.
what that's going to look like. So let's practice some stuff now that you can take with you. And on the other side of the coin, we've had some folks who have come to us, and at the same time they're in our program, on the weekends, they are working on those, applications. And to your point of sort of building momentum, sometimes they're having a successful experience with us. They're feeling good. They're feeling like, okay, I've taken that academic break. Like, I am having a good experience. Like, I'm good at work. Like, I've got some confidence now. And sometimes that can help if they've been, maybe the year before they were just super stuck and all they could do was make it through senior year. Well, we've built some of that confidence. And so now it is a reasonable goal on the weekends. Mom says, hey, you need to get, 3 applications in the next month done. So we've seen both, in our program, folks do it both ways.
Yeah. I think that last point you just made, Caitlin, too, is so spot on. Because I think when we see that spark in our students, like, if they are applying to college from the gap year, then we can potentially capitalize on that, that new energy, that stronger voice that is coming out.
Yeah, that's a good
Um,
point.
and certainly you could be writing about your experience, depending on how the timing all works, and that's wonderful and maybe obvious, but I think it's actually the quality of how a young adult is putting themselves forth will be decidedly different, more mature, um, in that second round of or first round potentially if they're applying during the gap year. Yeah.
Okay, well, I haven't seen any questions in the gap, so you obviously answered absolutely everybody's
I'd love to
questions.
think that.
Yeah. So, okay, let's talk about everybody's got their email addresses up here, but what can folks find on your websites? Jane?
Well, information about the gap year, of course. And what I really encourage is for families to take us up on a free introductory call. Webinars are great. They're broad. It's useful, I know, but it's the most useful is you and your story. So I really encourage families, even if it's a tentative possibility. I don't expect anyone to come to me with 100% having decided is what they're doing. But if it's a question in your mind that this is the right path for a student of yours, your child, then yeah, schedule a free call so that we can kind of get into the nitty gritty of it and really hear the story, hear more about this young adult because they are the star of the show, and seeing what might really could be possible for them. So I always encourage that. And I would say following us or following other programs, like I said, on social media is such a great passive way to start to fill your daily feed and algorithm with gap year stuff. Gap year initially can feel incredibly isolating. Like we're the only ones talking about this in our family, in our community, in our graduating class, and the kids feel it and the parents feel it. And so if you come to more webinars or you start to passively follow people on social media without getting inundated with emails, you'll also, I think, feel more connected to the community. And there'll be giveaways and, you know, open houses and reports from the field and highlighting students and so much good stuff. So, choose the social media that's the one that works for you and start to follow programs. Stay part of the conversation, even if passively to start, because I think it'll really continue to fill your sense of confidence in what an astounding opportunity this can be.
And I know you and Jason for a while were trying to do a once a month webinar. I can't
Yeah.
imagine.
Yep.
Are you still doing that?
We do webinar
Oh,
Wednesdays once a month. That's all the information's on our website about that.
great.
Anyone who's even sat in on something like this, I'm like, well, then the next step is always a call, right? But you could
Yeah.
definitely do a webinar Wednesday and share that widely with people. And then we are keynote speakers at the USA Gap Year fairs. So
Hmm.
in January and February, we'll be in, Boston and Connecticut and Colorado and California and Virginia. So a lot of opportunities to also come meet us in person, meet Gap Year programs in person too. Yeah.
But also importantly, because we're recording this for YouTube, if you're watching this on YouTube and you missed a chance to talk to Jane, during this live event, join one of the Wednesday webinars.
Yeah.
And Caitlin, whoops, sorry, we have an angry cat. Go
Um,
ahead.
yeah, if you head over to the Broad Futures website, you will get a lot more information about our internship programs, what type of internships we have, which employer partners we've worked with. We've got some really cool testimonials up there from alumni of our program, from families, to really just hear what those folks' experiences were. And similar to Jane, you can join. We do a monthly information session where you can hear, the nitty gritty about our program and get a lot of questions answered. And also reach out to us via the website so that you can set up a call with me or someone on our programs team to really talk specifically about the young person that is in your family or you're advising, to really see if it's a good fit.
And one thing I hear, I just want to grab on what you just said, Caitlin. I heard you say, talk to us about your young student. Talk to your young student too,
Yeah.
your
Yeah.
young person. I know in previous conversations I've had with Jane and Jason, it has to also be your student's idea. You can bring this idea to them, but it really has to be something that they're interested in for that to make sense. And so this has been terrific. Thank you so much. So if you're watching us this on YouTube, as I said, follow up with these folks and join another live webinar and have a chance to ask your questions. Let anybody you know who missed this conversation that they can watch this on YouTube. I'm going to have my assistant fix the captions, and then it'll go up on my YouTube channel. Just look for my name under LD Advisory. And then we'll do it again next year. Folks can join live. Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.
Thank you.
You all.